My name is Brian Siegel, and I'm the CEO of the Jewish Community Center. It is my pleasure to welcome you on this Sunday afternoon as we present Michael Oren, author of The Night Archer. The goal of the Detroit Jewish Book Fair is to bring the best new Jewish books and authors from around the world to Metro Detroit. This year, the rooms we're all sitting in may be different, but the purpose remains. The book fair runs until December 9th, and we have an exceptional lineup of events planned. To see our full event schedule, learn about ways to support book fair, watch events you may have missed, and find our online store where you can find The Night Archer and plenty of other hand-selected books and gifts, visit our website at culturalarts.jccdet.org/bookfair. To repeat that, that's culturalarts.jccdet.org/bookfair. This year, in order to provide as much programming to the community as possible, we've made all of our events free of charge. So if you enjoy this event and other book fair events, please consider becoming a patron or donating to book fair. You can do either or both at our website. Once again, culturalarts.jccdet.org/bookfair. We rely on community support to make this annual event possible, so thank you in advance for becoming part of the family. The book fair team would like to thank the sponsor of this event, JCC of Metro Detroit's Henry and Delia Myers Library, Dr. Robert Oliver and Joan Jampel, and the co-sponsor, the Spencer M. Partridge Charitable Foundation. Thank you all. We have a really special event for you this afternoon, and we want you to be a part of it. You can ask questions and offer comments in the YouTube comments section below, or by texting the number in the corner of your screen. Our speakers have a great discussion prepared, and they will take as many of your questions as they can. While you're here at our YouTube channel, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and click the reminder bell. That way, you'll never miss any of our exciting events. I also want to extend our deepest gratitude to the Book Fair Committee. This has been a challenging year, of course, and your dedication, commitment, and hard work have made this exciting festival possible. The focus of today's event is The Night Archer and other short stories. We have with us the author of the book, Michael Oren, as well as Steve Israel, who will moderate the discussion. The Night Archer is a collection of short stories that explores the outer bounds of imagination by crisscrossing genres and exposing the reader to a kaleidoscope of human emotions and experiences. The author of The Night Archer, Michael Oren, was Israel's ambassador to the United States, a parliamentarian and governor minister, a combat veteran, an athlete, and an historian. He's the author of 3 New York Times bestsellers, winner of the LA Times History Book of the Year Award, and winner of the National Jewish Book Award. Our moderator, Congressman Steve Israel, is the former U.S. representative for New York's 3rd Congressional District, serving from 2001 to 2017. He is the author of the novels The Global War on Morris and Big Guns, which he told us about in an online book discussion over the summer. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Michael Oren and Representative Steve Israel. Thank you, gentlemen.
Well, Brian, thank you so much for your leadership of the Detroit JCC. And let me also thank Jamie Loeb for the extraordinary work that she does and everyone who's been involved in the Jewish Book Fair in Detroit. I am so excited to be with you this afternoon. I'm in New York, and I have been looking forward to this for some time. Michael Oren is a very special individual. And Brian, I know you introduced him formally. I just have to say, I got to know him when I was in Congress and he was Israel's ambassador to the United States. We spent some time together, and the thing that really impressed me about him was not just the depth of his scholarship, the books that he's written, absolutely extraordinary books, but he was so well respected on both sides of the aisle and on both sides of Pennsylvania Avenue, respected in the Congress, in the House, in the Senate, but also so respected in the White House. And so I'm so thrilled to be able to participate today. Michael, this book, The Night Archer, I have to tell you, it was a surprise to me. I read 6 Days of War. I read Power, Faith, and Fantasy. I've read your analysis in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Atlantic. I've studied your take on Middle East history. I've known you not only as a diplomat, but a historian. And now suddenly there is a book, a compilation of short stories that as I was reading it, I kind of felt like I was reading a little bit of Ray Bradbury, a little bit of Rod Serling in The Twilight Zone, but a little Saul Bellow as well. What makes this a Jewish book, and how did you make the transition from writing history and analysis to this wonderful compilation of short stories?
Well, thank you, Steve. Thank you for that very warm reception. I didn't always get it in Congress and in the White House, but thank you nevertheless. And for you, certainly, I did get it. Thanks to the Detroit Jewish Book Fair. I was brought 20 years ago to my first time to the Detroit Jewish Book Fair. Andy Roisman brought me there. She's still bringing me. And to this extraordinary community, to Spencer Partridge and all the wonderful people who made this possible. Jamie Loeb, thank you all, and welcome to our discussion. You got it backwards, Steve. I didn't make the transition from writing history, writing fiction. I made the transition from writing fiction to writing history. I came home one day when I was 12 years old, and I had a strange feeling. It wasn't the usual feeling you have when you're 12 years old, but I sat down actually in this office. I'm at my parents' house in New Jersey. Unfortunately, my father's unwell, but I sat down at this desk, and what transpired was a poem. I had never written poetry before. And every day I wrote a poem. And then I moved on to short stories. I moved on to plays. I moved on to film scripts. When I was 17, I won the PBS Young Filmmakers Award. And then I went off to Hollywood as a young man to become, believe it or not, Orson Welles' assistant. That's another story. You think working in Congress is rough. Try working with Orson Welles. Oh my God. And so I always was writing fiction. You know, as my parents are quite aged, my father's nearly 96, my mother's 92. We've been cleaning out the attic. And in the attic, I found literally reams of things I wrote as a young person, and it was poetry and short stories, and and also along with them interspersed all the rejection notices I got, because they could probably fill a file the size and width of the Manhattan phone book. So I was deeply, what I was at base was a writer. And I also believe that writers shouldn't be teaching necessarily in English departments or creative writing departments. They should be like you. They should be in Congress. They should be people of the world, right? And there was a time when writers were like this, and Hemingway and Fitzgerald would be out there doing things and not just teaching about writing. And I want to design my life that way. And I studied history. I studied Middle Eastern history. I studied diplomacy. And the greatest compliment I used to get as a history writer was, hey, your history books read like novels. And I love that. And the reason for that, because you have a sense of the drama. I mean, the 6 Day War is a wonderful drama. You have to work very, very hard to ruin that drama. And I think it also, and I'd be interested to hear your perspective on this, I think it also helps you with diplomacy. I think that understanding human nature and the way people's emotions work, the way their brains work, is an immense tool, either in politics or in foreign relations.
Writing, you said, was your base, and so that's your passion, and then you become tremendously successful in diplomacy. You're a member of the Knesset. You're in the government. Tell us about how you balance that. Did you wake up at 5 a.m. and write, and then go to your day job? What was your regimen? Well,
I think as a member of Congress, are you allowed to publish books? I know the Senate can, or you can, but the Senate can't. In Israel, under Israeli law, if you're in government, and certainly if you're in high office, I was the deputy to the prime minister, you can't publish books. But nobody prohibits you from writing books. So very, very early in the morning, I'd get up and write. For example, this collection of stories were almost all written during the time when I was in Knesset and in the prime minister's office. So, and yeah, there's a certain amount of release from that, but I've always written. And this is actually my third work of fiction. Two previous, one collection of short stories all based in the Negev desert, because I actually lived in the Negev desert for many years, and a previous novel based on my father's World War II experiences called Reunion.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about the book specifically. It's a Jewish book, and yet it's an anthology of essays that, as Brian said, really explore the outer bounds of human nature. What makes this book Jewish in your view?
Well, there are stories in the book that are Jewish. Some of them are set in Israel. There are several stories that deal with the Holocaust, and they are Jewish in the sense that I think generally fiction writing is Jewish. We in Israel we dig a lot underground and we come up with a lot of artifacts, but we're hard pressed to point out a unique Jewish artistic tradition. Everything's borrowed from the Romans and the Greeks. We know that there were musical instruments in the Bible, but we don't know what they sounded like. But we do have, in vast quantities, is literature, and most of that literature is short stories. The Bible is a collection of short stories. When I'm not in New Jersey, I'm in Jaffa. The book of Jonah takes place in Jaffa. It's all of a page and a half long, and it's a great economy of language. You can discuss the book of Jonah endlessly. I actually think it's a political primer, but all of a page and a half. And we have a unique notion of writing in Judaism. That is a very unique tradition, and it relates to the Jewish concept of freedom. So freedom is important in Judaism, in our history. We have many words in Hebrew for freedom. We have like 5 or 6 words: cherut, atzmaut, dror, chofesh. But the Jewish concept of freedom is different than many types of freedom. Those of us who grew up in the 60s and the 70s, I know you're too young to remember those things, Stephen, but remember what freedom was like then. It was like anything goes, but that's not the Jewish notion of freedom. The Jewish notion of freedom is you can only be truly free if you have restrictions, if you have law. So, you can go you can have an exodus from Egypt. You can even have a holiday dedicated to the exodus from Egypt to freedom. But then you're going to end up at Sinai, and Sinai you're going to have laws, and it's Passover where we have the most restrictions. Our holiday for freedom has the most restrictions. So that's the Jewish concept, and that's very much what writing is like, and that is certainly what short stories are like. Because short stories, in a certain way, are the ultimate freedom. You can be anywhere, any person, anytime you want to be, but you've got 3 pages to do what a novelist does in 300 pages.
Right.
And every word has got to count. You've got to have the dialogue, you have the development, you've got to have your characters, you have dramatic tension in what could be really a page and a half. Now, I love the Jewish concept of freedom. I love our literary tradition, and I love the short story.
By the way, Michael, I will tell you that no member of Congress in the history of that institution has ever been able to say anything or write anything in less than 500 words. So reading it was just extraordinary. Folks, before we probe into the book, and we're going to talk about some of the specific stories in the book, but before we do that, let me encourage you, if you have a question or a comment, text it to 248-973-7286. That appears on your screen, but just in case, text those comments and questions to 248-973-7296, and I will choose questions and relay them to Michael. Michael, on this issue of the freedom limit paradox, I just want to explore that if we can, because I'd never heard it before. It seems so sensible. And you expand on that in the book. I'm going to read from the introduction. You say that this freedom limit paradox is yet another Jewish gift to civilization. It deeply influenced the founding fathers who hardwired it into their constitution and the system of checks and balances.
Certainly.
Along with prescribing absolute power and protecting the weak, 2 more biblical concepts, it laid the basis of American democracy, but it also informed Zionism. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Sure. Well, obviously about the Constitution and checks and balances. This is not the freedom of the 60s. It's saying you have freedom because you have limits on your power. And that's the only 2 guarantee of freedom. But with Zionism, we sought sovereignty. We sought sovereignty in our homeland. But we understood that with sovereignty comes responsibility. That famous line from the Anglo-Irish poet Yeats, who said that in dreams begin responsibility. So, Herzl said, if you will, it is no dream, but you're going to have the dream. You're going to have responsibilities. You're going to have to serve in the army. You're going to have to pay taxes. You're going to have to, you get a ticket from a traffic top, you're going to have to pay that ticket. You're going to have to bear the consequences of your democratic vote, because if you vote somebody who, maybe is criticized for his policies, you're going to bear that responsibility. So it's really endless responsibility in the context of the Zionist enterprise, which is the state of Israel. So I love that kind of freedom. It's kind of freedom that speaks to me. It's the very similar freedom that I find in short story writing. We can be a free people in our land, as we sing in Hatikva, but it's not the freedom of Woodstock. It's the freedom of Philadelphia, 1776.
Did you find a sense of freedom as you were writing these short stories, being able to write about subjects and topics in human nature that you weren't particularly known for?
Well, I set out to write a different type of short story collection. Now, most short story collections, including the ones that I love, are usually about one town in Maine or one town in Mississippi, or if you served in Vietnam, they're about Vietnam. I set out to write over 50 stories that each one is completely different. With almost different styles, different perspectives, different times. There are historical stories, there are ghost stories, there are mystery and murder stories, there are love stories, there are faith stories. And that to me was amazing freedom. The process is almost always the same. I'll be doing the dishes, something mundane, and all of a sudden this short story will hit me. And my first reaction is, nah, that's too out of the box. That's too bizarre. And then that feeling when you sit opposite the screen, it's sort of glowing at you, it's empty, and you start to type. And the story I don't go to the story comes to me. And not all of them make it. Not all of them make it. I live with a very brutal literary critic who's great, Leslie, to whom the book is dedicated. But it's that process. And it's interesting. When I'm finished writing, I usually have no memory of it. So it's a deeply spiritual, almost trance-like process.
Mm-hmm. Now, you made a reference to Vietnam. One of the things that really struck me about the book is you have several stories that deal with military themes, but American military historical themes. You deal with there's one story that takes place in the 19th century military themed World War II stories. How much of that did you derive from your own experiences serving in the IDF?
Well, again, we talked about my father. My father landed on Normandy Beach and fought all the way through. So I grew up, he remained in the reserve. So I spent part of my childhood on American military bases. And as an ambassador, my American military familiarity was a very important tool. I visited West Point, all the academies, many Army bases, and it was important for my relations with the Pentagon. I served in the Israeli military as a reservist, as an officer for close to 30 years. I participated in several wars. And all of my personal military experience gets compressed into one story that's a page and a half long, which was, for me, a very profound story. But the military experience generally informs many stories. Some of them are not visibly Israeli. There's one story that's actually based on a diplomat I knew, a woman ambassador who was married, but her first husband had been killed in the Yom Kippur War. And I asked myself, what is it like to be the next husband of the widow of a hero, a war hero? And so there's a story called The Widow's Hero, or The Hero's Widow. And it doesn't say it takes place in Israel, but anybody who knows Israel knows that it's an Israeli story. And so that's there also. There's a story called Dead of Old Wounds, mm-hmm. which opens up with the son of a man who's in his late 90s who has died, and the doctor has informed him that the cause of death was a bullet lodged in his pelvis that he received in the Normandy landing. And Dead of Old Wounds, but of course the story is not about Normandy. It's not even about that old wound. It's about an old wound in the relationship of the son with his wife, and how you can die of old wounds. So generally speaking, Steve, I want my stories to be a story that entertains my reader, but I also want it to be about something. I want it to be about relationships. I want it to be about love. I want it to be about God. And a couple of stories where God is a character. And that's my goal.
We have some questions lining up in the queue. Before we get to them, just kind of a general question about what inspired some of these stories. You have one story in particular that deals with a a Christian reenactor of a Jew in a restaurant that has become a destination for tourists in a village that whose Jewish population had been wiped out in the Holocaust. What the title of that essay, I believe, is "The Reenactor." What inspired that particular story?
First of all, thank you for asking me about that story. No one has ever asked me about that story. It's one of my favorites, even though, favorites in italics, because it's a very tough story.
Yeah.
Several years ago, I headed a mission from the IDF and the Israel Defense Forces to Auschwitz. And en route, we stopped off in a village. And this village was formerly a center of Jewish life. It had, it had a synagogue. It had a Jewish museum. It had a klezmer center. It had Jewish restaurants, that served kreplach and matzah brai, but there were no Jews. And many people were running these restaurants sort of dressed in Jewish fashion. The klezmer musicians had, I guess, clip-on peyot. And I asked myself, what does it mean to be a Polish peasant? And that's what this is about. It's about a Polish peasant who has to dress up every day as a Jew, when in fact he doesn't even know sure he's ever met a Jew. And it becomes about his relationship to the memory of the people who were massacred in this town. And it's the reenactor. He's playing the part of a Jew, and in a strange way, a very strange way, he kind of envies the victims of the Holocaust.
Yeah.
Because there's a certain meaning.
Chilling story. Just absolutely gripping. Let's see. Cheryl Corlitz asks, what language you prefer writing in?
That's the painful question, Cheryl. Thank you. I speak Hebrew. I interview in Hebrew. I write for the Israeli press. But I have found that the language of my soul, alas, is English. And I view it actually as a failure. I wish I could write, the way Aram Appelfeld, who didn't, Hebrew was not his native language. He taught himself Hebrew. I wish I could do that. I've tried. It's a failure. What can I do? Inside here lurks an English author. What can we do?
Another question. Did you purposely set out to keep the stories very short, or did it just happen that way?
No, I set out it happens that way, but I also think that's part of the discipline. And I'm trying to keep them as short as possible. It turns out that some of my favorite stories, unfortunately, are the longer stories. You mentioned this story that's set on the American frontier in 1841. It's called Metaxas. Mm-hmm. I know you like that story because you love American history. And I remember that great poster of Lincoln and McClellan in the tent at Antietam in your office. How about that? That I remember that.
That is perceptive. You are an observer.
Oh, the slows. He's got the slows. I don't know if anybody's going to get that, but we get that. We're both Civil War buffs, And I got a story about the Civil War in there too.
Yeah,
it's about reenactors, and I just so much wanted that story to be short, and it ended up being like 9 pages. And in a certain way, I view that as kind of a failure too.
I want to go again, folks. We're talking about this amazing book by Michael Oren, The Night Archer. Order it, get it. It is just exquisite reading and gripping reading, as I said. I'd like to go I'd like to read a passage, if I may, Michael, in one story.
I'm going to turn on the light because the sun is going down.
Okay, fair enough. And then we'll get to some additional questions.
See me a little better.
You have a great story called Afikomen, and I'm going to read a little bit from it, and I want everybody, as I read this, to think about whether it reminds you of any particular scene. You write about the matzah hunt at a Seder, and the narrator of this story says, the matzah hunt feels like hours away, and until then I have to sit here while Uncle Harold rails on and on about Watergate. He's a fascist. That's what our president is, a fascist and a crook. He slams a fist on the table next to my dad's fork, making it jump. And you voted for him. Auntie Rita, Harold's wife, looks on nodding while Mom spoons another matzo ball into her husband's soup. Yet Dad doesn't touch it. He doesn't say a word, but drinks his wine even faster than I do and gazes into the candles. A fascist, a crook, and an anti-Semite, if you ask me, Uncle Harold. Uncle Harold's still shouting. Handelman, Ehrlichman, sounds like the goddamn Nazi party, except for that Kissinger schmuck. That ass licker. Feel good about that, Artie? That's who you wanted in the White House. Now, you must have written this story before Thanksgiving, but my Thanksgiving Day table sounded a little bit like that. And
My Thanksgiving sounded exactly like that.
like that.
And it took I'd say 20 seconds before the T word was spoken.
Yeah.
Okay. And then everything came apart. And amazing. You know,
was it inspired by the fact that families have broken into open warfare over President Trump?
Yes, that too. That too. We had. I got to tell you the story because my father has wonderful caregivers, and but they're European, and we're talking about Trump's recognition of Jerusalem, and you know whether it was good for American Jews or bad for American Jews, and all of a sudden the caretaker out of nowhere says, "Well, you know, it's obvious why Trump did it because Jews control this country and they control all the money, so Trump did it for the power and the money." Like, and we all stopped and looked at her saying, "Oh my God, protocols of the elders of Zion come to our Thanksgiving table." And it went on after the turkey. It went on after the pecan pie, after the pumpkin pie. You know, by the pumpkin pie, we were you know deep into constitutional institutions. I think this is very Jewish. Talk about Jewish.
Yeah.
You know, in Jewish history and Jewish culture, we have this notion of a tish, Yiddish meaning table. And in our culture, it's around the table that we thresh out these things, and you know, pounding on that table, and we do. And if at the end of the evening we're still talking to one another, it's great. You know, in this particular tish, this Afikom, which takes place obviously in the early 1970s, and it's told from the perspective of a 13-year-old boy who's bored to death. It's that discussion presents a backdrop for a discovery that will change this 13-year-old boy's life and the way he looks at reality. All the while from looking for the Afikomen, which in our tradition is also a symbol of secret meanings.
Right. You mentioned the word favorite story. You talked about that in my last question. Let's go into that a little bit. We may have to put you on the spot because you said it's a challenge to pick. But there are several questions that ask whether you have a favorite story or what stories were among your favorites in the book.
Well, I have one or two favorite stories. One of them we mentioned is called Metaxas. It's a very challenging story, and I had a problem of where to place it in the collection. I placed it sort of toward the front. I hope it doesn't discourage people because it is a complex story. It does take place in 1841 on an American military fort that is abutting the Rocky Mountains. It's about the commander of this fort, who's a sort of disgruntled man, and he confronts in the mountains, for want of any better word, a monster. And to research the story, I went into the U.S. Army archives and read correspondence from the 1840s because I wanted to get the language just right. And Stephen, I know you're going to appreciate this. The actual format of the letters is just the way they wrote the letters.
It was amazing. Absolutely stunning.
But isn't that fun to do that? To
go
back in there. And then I also began a study of Native American lore about Bigfoot and monsters who lurked in the mountains. And many of the words they use, even metaxas, is a play on a Native American word for Bigfoot. But metaxas also comes from Plato's Symposium. And it deals with the question of human halfness. Are we half God, half man? Are we half animal and half man? You know, the Greeks had this fascination with centaurs and minotaurs. And it's about halfness. But it's also about being on the American frontier in 1841. And I taught military history. So I knew the uniforms, I knew the weapons. And so that wasn't the challenging thing. The challenging thing was the language. And to me, I could go back and I could read that story and enjoy it immensely. The other favorite story, unfortunately, is also one of the longer stories. It's the penultimate story, and it's called the Betsy Bob.
Yeah.
And I got to tell you, I have no idea where this story came from. It's the only story where I really don't know where it came from. I was traveling with my wife through the American South last summer when one traveled in that world. Mm-hmm. We were doing the Freedom Trail through Selma and Atlanta and Montgomery. I'd never done this. We've always wanted to do this. And all of a sudden, boom, this idea comes to me of the Betsy Bob. Now, It's about 4 Jewish girls who go to an upscale camp in Maine, and while they're at this camp, they sneak off into the woods one day and they encounter something extraordinary that will change their lives. And then 30 years later, for different reasons, they try to go back to the place and re-experience and re-encounter this spiritual being they call the Betsy Bob. Now, I didn't go to an upscale camp. I actually went to YMCA camp, which my father insisted on calling the Young Men's Hasidic Association. And I went to church every Sunday, and really not that upscale camp. So I didn't know about this world. I had to find out about it, from my wife, but who did. But it's I think a very deeply spiritual story. It's a very Jewish story. If you know the Talmudic tale of the 4 rabbis who go into the woods, and each one encounters God in a different way, and has a different experience. It's almost a disquisition on that Talmudic story. And I had a wonderful time reading this story, even though it's not an easy story, not at all. So the Betsy Bob.
I want to talk about one story that literally gave me chills at the end, the prodigal son.
Mm.
It is really a communion between a father and son. And I don't want to give away the ending, which did chill me. But can you talk about what motivated that story?
I have a fascination with ghosts. I have obviously a fascination with death for some reason. Mm-hmm. And it is about a meeting between a father and a son, one of whom's a ghost.
Mm-hmm.
One of whom's a ghost. No spoiler. No spoiler. Stories come out of experiences.
Yeah.
And whether it be a political experience, I know there's one story you must have liked about social climbers in Washington.
Oh my God! I know those people, Michael. I know those people.
I know those people, and I bet you we know the same people. Right. To those of you out there in Detroit and elsewhere, there's a phenomenon that exists in Washington of people whose profession is to socially climb. And they spend a lot of money on it. They actually hire advisors. And it comes from an expression in Washington: to get good table, you have to give good table, right? So if you want to be invited to a good table, you have to invite the people. But then the seating becomes an issue, and of course the Mount Everest of all this is to get invited to the White House. And it's about one of these couples. They're reconcilable to you, but sometimes these stories come out of very painful experiences. I'll just give you one, and I'll keep it short. In my last diplomatic position as the Prime Minister's deputy for diplomacy, I undertook a number of diplomatic missions abroad, and one of them was to Lithuania. Now, Israel has a very good relationship with Lithuania today. It's one of our closest friends, but during the Holocaust, your chances of surviving the Holocaust in Lithuania were probably fewer than in any other country in Europe. Just vicious. And my maternal grandparents came from Lithuania. And of course, they came to America before the Holocaust. But my grandmother used to talk to me about pogroms and hiding in the basement, hearing the hoofs of the Cossacks. So I mentioned this to the foreign minister of Lithuania, a wonderful man. He says, we're going to take you to this village. So the next day, he took me in his car 70 kilometers outside of Vilnius to a town called Anishkaya, which in Yiddish was called Anisht. And I went I visited the place in the woods where the Jews were taken out and shot one day in 1941. I visited the streets where my grandmother lived, and Synagogue Street. The synagogue was a bakery. I saw the homes with the basements, and I came away from this story not knowing how I could somehow process this into a story. I didn't understand it. And I came home to Israel, and I sat at the computer, and I began to write one of several triptychs in these short stories. They're short stories made of 3 different stories that come together. But this triptych traces a family from Anisht through 4 generations, not necessarily in chronological order, from the shtetl through the Holocaust to the state of Israel, back to Lithuania, and I think it's a story that comes from a very, very painful place. It's called Anisht, and some of it's funny, but it comes from a very painful place.
You know, you mentioned that that story kind of it percolated while you were on a diplomatic mission. There is a related question. Cheryl asks, was Ambassador Oren ever in a diplomatic meeting and started creating a story from it?
I'm trying to think. I'm thinking it through. I mean, I think about a diplomatic meeting, if you include a lot of dinners in Washington, the answer is yes. I think there's a sense of realpolitik. There's another very complicated story called the 30-year rule, which, and if I had an hour, I'd tell you about it. I just read it. It's a story that comes. It's a double entendre. 30-year rule is the rule under which democracies release their diplomatic correspondence after 30 years. But it's also about an imaginary island in the Indian Ocean, over which Britain ruled for 30 years. Mm-hmm. And it's a story about a former British diplomat going back to the archives and reading reports that he had written 30 years before, trying to get to the truth of what happened on this island. And much of what transpires in the embassies there, and it's in the British embassy, the American embassy, the Soviet embassy, comes out of my experience of being in an embassy. Mm-hmm. It also comes out of my experience of writing diplomatic correspondence. Because if anybody believes, and many historians do believe, it's called positivism, that documents, diplomatic cables, are the most accurate reflection of actually what happened in history. Believe me. Bularkey. Diplomats write cables knowing they're going to be read in 30 years, and they give it a spin.
Let me remind folks, if you have questions, and we have several of them, we're going to wrap up at exactly 5 o'clock. So if you do have a question, don't forget to text it to 248-973-7286. That's 5 o'clock New York time, East Coast time, 248-973-7286. Michael, a question from our audience. Are you writing during the pandemic? And is there any inspiration in what is happening now in our world?
Yes. Okay. So I'm writing several projects. I have at least one nonfiction project. I have contracted by Random House to write a book about the 1948 War of Independence. It's a many-year project to do for that war what I did for 67. But I'm well into a next novel. We discussed earlier that I have a novel coming out in April called "To All Who Call in Truth." It's a very Jewish novel. You said it has echoes of Saul Bellow. The editor is the son of Saul, Adam Bellow.
Wow.
And a Jewish book set in a suburban Jewish community in 1972. And some of you, it will speak to you deeply, I'm sure. A troubled period in American history, which I think evokes in many ways the current situation. I am writing another novel that, strangely enough, has almost no Jews in it. And it is set on an imaginary island. I apparently like imaginary islands off the coast of Massachusetts in 1944. And it's about a female detective trying to solve a multiple murder in 1944. And I'm well into my second collection of short stories. So you asked me whether the pandemic has affected us. It's affected in two ways. One is that it gives you a lot of writing time that you don't have. It has doubled my writing time, so I can do all these projects at the same time. But in the section collection of short stories, I'm also dealing with the question of a pandemic. And in one particular story, I don't want to do a spoiler. It's called "The Song for the New Epidemic." It's about an epidemiologist who has discovered a plague that affects the human heart. And it affects the human heart when the heart is at its weakness, and when it's at its weakness is when it's in love. And the plague strikes at people who are in love around the world.
Are you right? So you're writing full time now?
No, I'm full time. I'm a consultant. I'm doing many things, but I still have my routine where I get up at 5:30 in the morning. I sit with my cup of coffee, and I get those sweet hours. Those sweet hours of writing. And you can write. I'm here now in New Jersey. I'm still getting up every morning and writing.
It's extraordinary. We have the same rituals. I awaken at 5 a.m. There is something about that period of time. I don't know if you have the same experience. There is something about the transition from sleep, dream to wakefulness in that period of time when the sun is not out and you have your coffee, where creativity just seems to flourish. For me, it then deadens at about 10 o'clock and I have to take a rest. You have the same experience?
Same experience. And it's, first of all, it's quiet.
Yeah.
And it's meditative. And it's, because the writing experience is very dreamlike. It's almost like a continuation of sleep.
Exactly. Let's see. We have a question from Linda. My mother was born in the same town in Lithuania. My husband and I visited there a few years ago and also walked the same streets. Isn't that something, Linda? Thank you for
Unbelievable. Unbelievable. Read the story. You'll enjoy the story.
Naomi was listening to you talk about the many genres that you're writing in, and she wants to know how are you able to manage the writing in so many different styles?
Because they come from different parts of your brain.
Mm-hmm.
So I can sit and write a novel, I can sit and write a short story, and then turn around and write an op-ed about the Iran nuclear deal. And it is completely different. It's like swimming in tennis. And it doesn't interfere with it at all.
I'd love to just revisit another essay that I loved. You have your favorites. I had mine. There was a short story called Alien Reports. You write in the voice of an alien en route to the planet Earth, and they're doing a report about our species. Well, I will be the spoiler on this. You conclude the alien report by saying the species we determined was simply too alien. Accordingly, we altered course, re-entered the portal, and left this galaxy behind. Tell us about what inspired that story.
I don't know. I think about, we think about aliens visiting this planet, and some of them are friendly, some of them are not friendly. But nobody asked the question: what do we humans look like from their perspective? And if an alien was getting a dispassionate readout on the human species, what would it say? It would say that these people go to war over things like baseball games and flags and they kill and eat some animals but treat other animals better than they treat humans, and very strange things about this species. But the alien concludes that the strangest thing about the species is not only that they're sort of gratuitously violent, is that they have this concept of I, where they see themselves as separate from the universe, which was alien to this alien's outlook, because they don't have a concept of I. And that is really I think the determining factor of whether or not to visit the planet Earth.
Now that story looks to me to be about 500 words. I'm just curious, how long did that take you?
Probably a day.
A day?
A day and a half. Yeah.
A lot of editing?
Yeah. No, not that much. I'm of the school that writes pretty much of a whole cloth. I do editing, of course, but it's not the Philip Roth style, which was Philip Roth would sit down and write 1,000 pages, and then the novel would slowly emerge.
Right.
My first line is the first line.
So I'm sorry, I missed that.
My first line is the first line. It's usually that first line.
Right. Michael, while we have you, we probably should talk about some current events. I want to, and we'll go back to the book. Before we get to some current events with the ambassador, let me remind you, forgive the glare, The Night Archer and Other Stories. You get this book.
I got it too.
Amazon, we got it too. There you go. Amazon, Barnes & Noble, any local bookstore. We like supporting local bookstores. Any place else folks should get the book? Yeah,
it's available on Apple, on bookstores. It's in digital form, it's an audio form. And if you go on Apple Podcasts, you'll see a series of podcasts by me called the Mind Behind the Story, where I talk about the stories behind the stories.
Great.
And I got to tell you, I just listened to it the other day. It was really interesting. I hadn't listened to it before. And those people who have listened to it, most importantly, my mother-in-law, have really enjoyed it.
So let's talk, if you don't mind, a little bit about what's happening in the world. New administration. I ought to just disclose that I'm a supporter of that administration. But that has nothing to do with this. But I have my own opinions, and they're well stated and frequently stated. There's some concern among many that the incoming administration, may somehow slide back from the approach of the Trump administration on a variety of policies. Let's begin with what's happening in Israel. What's your sense of there's a sense of that the Israeli electorate very supportive of President Trump, that it is as polarized as we are here. How would you characterize the Israeli electorate right now?
Well, it's polarized, but not around what it's multi-polarized because we don't have a two-party system. And where I live in Jaffa, every night there's a major demonstration. Demonstrating are people who hate Bibi and think he should resign because of the charges against him, the corruption charges. There are anarchists, there are peaceniks, there are any number of grievances represented there. So it's not just people who are for and against, say, Donald Trump or the Republicans and the Democrats. So that's a fractured nature of Israeli politics. It's one of the strengths of our country. We actually can't be polarized the way you are in the United States. We have to reach across multiple aisles. But it's also our weakness because it is fractured. It is indeed. It was interesting what happened with me in Israel. I was one of the two people in Israel who knew Joe Biden very, very well. The other one was Netanyahu, and he wasn't talking. So for about a week and a half, I was on nonstop. Everyone wanted to know who Joe Biden was. And I had to tell Israelis that he is a good man. He is an honest man. He's of the generation that still has Israel in its heart. He remembers 67. He remembers 73. It's a generational thing. He is obviously very comfortable around the Jewish people. I used to attend his Rosh Hashanah party every year. But he used to sometimes play good cop, bad cop with Obama, with Israel, but he was like a genuine good cop. He was playing good cop. He actually cared about this. And but having said that, the Democratic Party has policies which will be at variance with some Israeli policies. There'll be the peace process, though I don't think this administration is going to invest very heavily in it. It's not an ideological issue. With Joe Biden, I think that while he is certainly not Donald Trump, but neither is he Barack Obama, for whom this was a very deeply held ideological position. Our big problem will be Iran, and that's been in the headlines all week this week, where, for many reasons, this administration will be committed to either reaffirming, but certainly addressing that issue again, whether America should or should not be in the Iran nuclear deal. For Israel, it's a no-brainer. We say no. And that deal was a strategic danger for us to remain so. So those are policy differences. I was also fortunate to know personally and politically most of the senior figures coming into the White House. Lincoln was a friend in Washington. Jake Sullivan's a friend in Washington. I know these people very well. They're exceedingly smart, very, very capable. We're going to have some policy differences. But it's not going to be, this is not 2009 Redux. It is not. It's something different. And I have advice for the administration, which is you are inheriting two things, which are, I think, give you a tremendous advantage. One, you're heading a Middle East that is far more stable than than 4 years ago with the Abraham Accords, which are amazing. And you have leverage. You have leverage over Iran. Don't squander that leverage. I understand there's an American interest vis-a-vis Iran. I understand that interest, but don't squander it, and don't lose don't lose sight of the fact of who these Iranians are. I've been listening to the reports about this assassination in Iran, and CNN and company are all saying that this was a scientist, and it's terrible that Israel assassinates a scientist. Farizad was a scientist, but he's also a general in the Islamic Revolutionary Guard. So he's a terrorist. He's a terrorist who's developing a weapon that's designed to kill 10 million Israelis, and they make no bones about it. So Israel has every right and every duty to defend itself. So that kind of statement you can make without saying, "Hey, we're at variance with each other. We view you as a hostile administration." It's not.
You were ambassador during some tough times in the relationship between the U.S. and Israel.
White hair. There we go. Yeah.
Yeah. You were in the trenches representing the state of Israel. What really worked between the two countries that people don't know enough about? What was the one thing that you felt was brought the two countries together that might be often disregarded by people or unknown to people?
This what I'm about to say is not a line, and I think you will note is not a line. The strategic relationship between the state of Israel and the United States is the deepest and most multifaceted strategic relationship that the United States has had with any foreign power in the post-World War II period. It is weapons development at the highest level. It is joint maneuvers, especially with special, people don't know that SEAL Team 6 trains in Israel. Before, by the way, they dealt with Osama bin Laden. It is intelligence sharing at the highest level. Really nothing compares to it in that way. So, that was totally unaffected by whatever political differences we had with the Obama administration. In fact, it got closer. It got more intense. We all saw Iron Dome.
Right.
We all saw the Arrow system. That doesn't happen without very, very close cooperation and support.
I remember when rockets were launched from Gaza to Sderot, and Israel's supply of Iron Dome missiles began to dwindle. And your successor, Ron Dermer, called Tony Blinken and said, "Listen, we have problems. We need a replenishment." That was done almost in lightning speed in the United States Congress. The administration asked for a supplemental appropriation. It was done on an absolutely bipartisan basis. So those are that kind of thing just doesn't get the attention that it deserves.
No, a lot of it. The problem is a lot of it we can't talk about. It's like the rabbi who sneaks off from shul on Yom Kippur and gets a hole-in-one, right?
Right.
So, big guy, who are you going to tell? Who are you going to tell? Some of the stuff we can't talk about.
Michael, Carol Kravitz asks, are you concerned that Arab countries are recognizing Israel in order to get weapons from the Trump administration?
No. How about that?
Okay. Succinct.
No. And again, this is something I'm going to say something. I'm going to steal your thunder here. There's a thing called qualitative military edge, which is it's an unprecedented commitment by the U.S. Congress to ensure that Israel can always defend itself by itself against any Middle Eastern threat or any combination of Middle Eastern threats. The president has to report to Congress that he's preserving what's called QME. And if UAE or other Gulf countries get advanced American weaponry, I am completely assured that America will compensate Israel and maintain our QME. That's the remark I just made, but okay.
Fully agree. Right. Let's see, Michael, I would love to return to one of the stories that we're going to go from current events to this insightful book, The Night Archer, and other stories. I'm going to keep plugging it because folks just definitely need to read it. Day 8, it begins, and God rose from resting and looked upon the world he created to affirm himself, gazing, admiring. See, I had on my glasses on, and it's getting dark in this room. Gazing admiringly at its surface, he saw that the heavens and earth remained separated, the seas and the land all swarming, soaring, and crawling with life. The light was still light, great, he pronounced, but not so fast, warned Satan. And then we get into a dialogue between God and Satan. Can you talk a little bit about that story? Again, one of my favorites.
So, listen, I'm a person of faith. I'm very much involved in my community in Shul in Israel, and I'm interested in questions of God and goodness and creation. This story grows out of a thoughts I had one Yom Kippur, actually when I was ambassador, and I began to think about creation. And the creation story begins with chaos, tohu vavohu. And the question then arises: did God create? We all know that God created the world, but did God create the chaos as well? Did God creates everything? Well, obviously created the chaos, and then in Jewish tradition, there's a certain Kabbalistic notion that God created the earth in order to fulfill something in himself. Because the question is, why does God create? Why bother? It has to be something about fulfilling God himself. So God creates earth to affirm himself. And then the final question is, there's Satan, but God must have created Satan too. So what's the purpose of Satan? So all of this comes down to a question about whether or not this species, again, these human beings who, when this story opens, are living in their own waste and have no sense of family connections. They're a miserable species. And Satan points us out to God. He says, it's great, but you failed at this one. Look at this thing. This thing is a disaster area. Whether that species should be endowed with a soul. And if so, what is the purpose of the soul? And who actually gets the most benefit out of the soul, God or Satan? And it's a deeply midrashic story, and it's steeped, I think, in our Jewish tradition. But I think it also could be a very unsettling story because it's not quite clear who gets the best end of the deal, God or Satan.
There are, I think, 53 essays in the book, correct? How many did you decide that you couldn't include, and what was that process like?
The process is always the same process. It's giving it to Leslie, who will say,
I was going to ask about Leslie.
which is she'll say, "I love you," but there's the but. You got to watch out for the but. And she's invariably right. The stories that don't make it are usually stories that are too close to me. I found that distance is one of the best guarantors. So writing about Satan and God is easy. Writing about an alien coming to Earth is easy. The minute I try to sort of recreate something that actually happened in my life, that's where I get in trouble.
Why?
Because things that seem, there's a line in my last book, last nonfiction book called Ally, where I say that the history is a humbling process because the events that we view in real time as monumental, in time become footnotes, right?
Sure.
And nobody remembers them. But it's true in life too. Some of the events that occurred to us seem to be tremendously profound and impactful. But when you try to write about them in a story 40 years later, the reader might say, so what? It's not that interesting. It was interesting to you. It's interesting to your memory, but it's not that interesting to the reader. And at the end of the day, and I know you'll agree with me, it's about the reader.
Yeah.
Yes, it's fulfilling to you, but if you're not going to read a story that people are going to love, why bother?
We have a saying in politics, you have to meet voters where they are, not where you are. And it's the same thing in literature, right? You have to meet the reader where the reader is, and not where you are. Michael, final comment on this. When people joined my staff when I was in Congress, I served on the Armed Services Committee and the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee. 6 Days of War was required reading. It also showed up, I will tell folks, on the required reading list and recommended reading lists of some of our senior military officers, Army War College, other branches of the military. So that was required reading in my office. And now for anyone who wants just a really great insight, a book that is both frightening and amusing and does explore the outer bounds of human nature and asks us to question ourselves. Please read The Night Archer and other stories. Ambassador Michael Oren, thank you for your leadership for the state of Israel in the United States and for your authorship. Thanks, everybody, and have a great night.
You too. Shalom, shalom.
Thank you to both of our guests, Ambassador Oren and Congressman Israel, for being here. My name is Jamie Loeb. I'm the director of the Detroit Jewish Book Fair, and I just want to say thank you all at home for being with us. Our next event is tomorrow evening at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, New York time. It will be our last pregame early bird event before Book Fair officially gets started on Tuesday morning. We hope you can join us. We will have Eric Bean with us, who is the author of Ethan's Healthy Mind Express, which is a first childhood primer for mental health. We hope you'll be able to join us tomorrow night, and have a great one.